All right, so today what I want to do is talk about domestic Soviet life. And so we were talking about the Cold War, its origins. There's lots more to say about the Cold War and in particular nuclear power, international events. But today we're going to move back into the Soviet experience. And I want to mostly talk about Khrushchev, the era of Nikita Khrushchev today. But I realized that I want to kind of go even farther back in time a little bit and talk about what I've kind of packaged in as Soviet transformations. But so if you recall, I'm going to kind of move through these slides. In the era of Stalin, there is a tremendous amount of energy that we are building socialism. We are going to create a new world, and it's gonna involve some hurt. It's gonna involve real commitment and sacrifice and striving. But when we get there, it's gonna be great. And much of building socialism involves straight up building. This is a picture of Magnitogorsk that I showed you and talked a bit about the tremendous efforts to build this city just out in the just out in the middle of nowhere in Siberia, south of the Urals, near some important ore supplies where Magnitogorsk kind of emerges out of nothing. Back in Moscow as well, the city, they really build the city. And this is one of what I think, or when I lived there, we talked about called like the Stalin skyscrapers. The city was marked, this is a picture of Moscow, and the city had 7 of these kind of skyscrapers. Some were apartment buildings and really nice apartment buildings that design of wings kind of coming out from a central place meant that you could kind of get more light into the place. And so they're nice apartment buildings. Um, or maybe that principle gets a little bit undermined by how huge they were. One of the buildings as well is MGU, and MGU stands for Moskovsky Государственный университет, and it is in many ways, was the Harvard of the Soviet Union, a very elite institution. And the first time when I traveled to no, not as a, so I first traveled to the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. And then I returned as an exchange student and studied there in 1994. And when I studied there in 1994, I visited MGU and we walked into this massive building. And it is really, for me, I had never encountered such huge buildings. I mean, I went on a trip to Washington, D.C. As an 8th grader. We had a class trip to Washington, D.C., and I saw our nation's capital and, walked the mall, and the kind of distance between the Smithsonian museums, if you've ever done that, that was massive. But that was massive. And hold on, I'm not sure if I'm recording her. Let me just, oh no, we are, sorry. But when I went to MGU for the first time, I had never encountered just such massive architecture. It takes so long to walk across the lawn. And since I've been to, if you've ever been to St. Petersburg, it has that similar feel. And since then, I've been to Vienna and Versailles, places I've never been to. And so you also get that feel of kind of massive architecture. It takes a really long time to get there. Anyway, MGU is that kind of a building. And we walked inside of this most prestigious university, and this was in 1994 when things are really falling apart. And I can remember walking down these long hallways that were dark and so creepy. And the people we were with said, yeah, they don't have, we don't have money for light bulbs right now. And so it was this kind of contradiction in terms of being in one of the most prestigious educational institutions on Earth. And the main highways, some classrooms or whatnot are branching, and offices are branching off from them. And it's dark. You can't really see. And since you're in a hallway, I mean, it's really dark. There's little bits of light, and it just had this very creepy feel that got even creepier when people were told me, and I, didn't go up there and explore myself, that oh yeah, the building is in such need of maintenance that some of the top floors have been condemned. They're unsound, and so there's just sort of abandoned floors where rats run rampant up in the upper. At the tallest floors of this building. No one can go there. There isn't money to fix it right now. So for me, that was you know, and as we'll see, 1994, things are rough. And that was kind of a 1994 moment. But back to in the 30s, when these buildings were getting built, they were emblematic of kind of a bright, happy future that was coming. And I want to take you back to this statue we've seen before. You'll see it a lot, of this glorious, strong, optimistic, capable future that will be built by this allegiance of the worker and the kolkhoz. So the workers and peasants will come together. Hammer represents the hammer and sickle. Hammer represents the industrial worker pounding steel into usable things, and the sickle represents the peasant, cutting her hay, forward-looking, strong. And this statue was made by the artist Vera Mukhina, who lived from 1889 to 1953. And you see this image in many places repeated. This another example of that kind of positive, forward-looking stance. I mentioned to you when I showed you the statue of the friendship of the peoples in a place called Vidinha. Vidinha is an acronym for the exhibition of economic achievements. Is in the wait, Выставка. What does the D stand for? Maybe is it выставка достижений народного хозяйства? That would be like the exhibition of достижения, achievements of народного хозяйства is kind of like has a little bit of an more agricultural feel than industrial, and this park speaks to both, but it is kind of the like economic achievements of the people. Maybe хозяйство, kind of maintenance of the people. The хозяин or хозяйка is kind of the master of the household. And so хозяйство is like the whole economy. And so not a perfect translation. But anyway, Vidinha is like, if you've ever been to Epcot Center, it's like an Epcot Center of economic achievements. Instead of going to like Jungle Land and Fantasyland or this sort of thing, you go around and there's like, these are achievements of agriculture. This is achievement of aviation. Here's achievements of physics. And again, it's large and monumental as part of the kind of the vibe of Soviet socialist realism, although there's a mix. Vidinha is really eclectic. It is a weird place, frankly. Yeah, I mean, just even thinking, I think of it as an Epcot Center of Economic Achievements. There's this statue of Stalin that was taken down in de-Stalinization, but it's an example of kind of this societal energy towards what we are building. And one of the things that they built and did beautifully was the metro. And in the metro 20s, 30s, the Moscow metro is being built, and it's the nicest metro I've ever been on in the world. Even the metro not that I've been on every metro, I've never been to East Asia, and I hear that Japanese infrastructure is amazing. But for example, the tube feels kind of slow and clunky. I've been to the metro in Paris, and I mean, it's crazy. You'll have a line that like some days of the week doesn't work, and so you have to get off or something like that. And I mean, there's a confusing metro. The Moscow metro kind of is fast, is comprehensive, and yeah, I'm really impressed by it. The first line of it opened in 1935, and then they've continued to build it. Actually, so the black and this first picture is a very early image of the metro. And then the metro here is, this was more or less the map of the metro when I lived there, 97 to 2000. And it was, but even then, there was huge construction and and a lot of pressure on it. Beyond this, Moscow is just an amazing city. If you were to kind of think of New York City, LA, and Washington, D.C. all in one, that's Moscow for you. I mean, it is the financial center, entertainment center, government center of the entire Soviet Union. And in some ways, this is a problem. Like Moscow, yeah, this is a problem. And the and so when I was there, there's so much growth, so much money there. You would have people that are not just coming into Moscow from the outer ends of the metro and coming in. And this would be, this is going to be a ride of, an hour and a half or so. Um, I lived at the station Tretyakovskaya and I got off at Botanichesky Sad. But and Vedinha, which I've been talking about, was the next stop over. And so if I got up there, it was actually a closer walk. I could go either way, kind of equidistant. Back in my Moscow days, when I can remember getting up, leaving my apartment, walking to the metro in total darkness, and then, taking my, 25-minute metro ride, and then exiting the metro in total darkness and walking like 15 minutes to this awful drafty warehouse, where I'd like go inside in the darkness. And some days I wouldn't come out again until it was, dark, because the days are shorter in winter for sure. I am going to share with you one little anecdote, and the point here is to just think about the massive infrastructure and kind of people movement that happens. When I was there, and I haven't looked up these statistics, they would say that Moscow was it had a sleeping population of 11 or 12 million and a daytime population of about 14 million. What does that mean? That means that during the day, you would have people train in to go to Moscow to have their jobs in Moscow. And I met this young man that was kind of my neighbor, and he and his mother invited me to their dacha one weekend. Okay, what's a dacha? Does anyone know what a dacha is? Go ahead, chime in if you know what a dacha is. Addie.
It's a summer house, like a vacation home.
Right. Well, excellent. The meaning of dacha has a huge expanse. We're going to look at Putin's palace, and some people say like, "Oh, it's dacha," and then, but the basic idea of dacha was the state allotted to people a little patch of property where they could have the experience of being in nature, where they could grow a garden and thereby supplement their food intake and their actually caloric production. And that became a really important way. And not everyone got them, but they were issued to urban people and they tended to be outside. And you'll see these patches. You can go on the electrichka. That is the electric train system that kind of picks up where the metro system ends and you're farther out in the countryside, and you can just see these, oh, I don't know, I mean, they vary a lot, but sometimes they're not more than, you could probably fit like half a dozen dachas in a football field. And there'll be something from just maybe like the slightest of shacks and a garden to pretty substantial property with a nice summer house. And actually, there's a history of dachas that I've assigned in the past, and this is a term they do start to use in the 18th century. In the 18th century, and at that point, so thank you, Addie, is giving us even the more historical definition. It could be like a summer estate even, the dacha. And then I guess it's during the Soviet period that you really have the state issuing these patches of property so that urban people could kind of get out into fresh air, in many ways, like in an attempt in some ways to fulfill, the promises of socialism where, there's dignity and access to nature and rest for all. Um, and so there's this dacha system. So you have this huge like migration of people going out and in. So anyway, I have this neighbor, they invite us to their dacha and and I go with them one weekend. We take the metro from so I think we went from, this was my metro stop. And what did we do? Because I'm pretty sure it was off the Serpukhova line. So we would have, yeah, kind of come down to the ring line and changed again, and then took it all the way to the end, and then take it to the end, and then got on another train, like the electric train system, and took the dacha and took that train out another hour and a half. All told, this is like a 4.5 hour trip on a Friday afternoon to go to the dacha. And so we get out, and it's this charming, very rustic little cabin. There's an outhouse, there's no plumbing. People are hauling water from a well down the street. And yeah, outhouse, rustic cabin, hauling water. There's berries. Um, Trees, her little garden. She's like taking, tending her garden for the weekend. And there were other people around too. And we went to visit them and had some samagon. This is homemade, like moonshine, really high proof alcohol. You don't want to drink a lot of it. And I remember from my days in Moscow, every now and then in the paper, you would read both about people that Atravilas were poisoned by and died fatally by a kind of batch of samagon that sort of fermented in a way that was, kind of ended up containing some bacteria or something. Similarly, as occasionally, I would read in the paper how someone died from being poisoned by mushrooms. Russians are fanatical for collecting mushrooms. I could tell you more stories about mushrooms. But so anyway, and we're offered samagon. I had just a tiny, tiny bit. And we, at the house of this neighbor, the thing that was so amazing to me is that the dad worked in Moscow every single day. He met his buddies. He met his buddies at about 4 a.m. on the platform, and they rode the electrichka and then rode the metro into Moscow and did manual labor jobs every day from, sort of like 9 to 4 or something, or 9 to 5. And then they would get on the train again and come back, and they would get home like between 9:30 and 10, 5 days a week, more or less, and then get up the next day and do it again. So a full 8+ hours of their day are going into transportation. And they've been doing it for decades. And it seemed to me they were the closest of buddies. They had worked out whether they read books or slept or chatted or played some cards. This had been their routine for decades. Meanwhile, this man is sharing a house with a woman who had been to Moscow twice in her whole life. And that they're the kind of the main shopping, they were farther enough. Now there was another town, and that's like where she would go to go shopping or things like this. But to this day, that just blew my mind. These people shared a house where he worked in the capital 5 days a week, and she had been there twice in her life. And that to me just kind of shows these like sinews of infrastructure and people moving, and also maybe well, for him at least in terms of income, the pull of Moscow. So and here are just some other pictures of the Moscow Metro, various entrances, people building the Moscow Metro, and each metro station, and especially in the summer, they have a particular design. Like this is in the station Revoluция, where you have kind of a woman who's fighting, and there's lots of statues along the way while you're waiting on the platform. This is the station, Mayakovskaya station, where up in each of these ceilings you have really beautiful mosaics with various like symbols of kind of Soviet life. Here you can already see like a peasant woman overseeing the harvest with a red flag behind her, and many of them kind of reference Mayakovsky's poetry, the great poet who ended up dying by suicide, whether that was coerced or not. He was I'm no expert on his story, but if an early enthusiast of the revolution became disillusioned. So there's building huge buildings in the city, building a metro to move people. And the Soviet Union, as I said, was going to also kind of really transform nature. They were going to the Soviet promise was so ambitious. We are going to remake humanity, and we can do anything. We can remake nature as well. Um, some examples of those, the Belomor Canal was a canal that they made from St. Petersburg up to the White Sea. This was a canal that was built mostly by prison labor, political prisoners, and other people that have been arrested for crimes, built these multiple stretches between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Lake Ladoga was during the blockade of Leningrad, as I said. When this lake froze, they had trucks kind of bringing material. And then at one point, when it was deemed safe enough, kind of excavating children out of the city and sending them to Kazakhstan and faraway places to live out the war. But it went all up through these Arctic conditions. We're talking permafrost, freezing, frozen ground, freezing conditions, and prisoners that pretty much have just to ice picks somewhere. I might once upon a time I had pictures, um, but I won't show you right now because I don't have them right in front of me. So this is the Bellamore Canal is an example of a brutal kind of effort to transform nature and build, and one that used criminals who were, despite all the promises of Soviet dignity, not afforded much dignity or much of anything. But the Soviet project got even more ambitious, and that included this. This is a propaganda poster, a public service message, and it says "Izasuhu Победим." Does anyone know what that means? Zasucha is kind of drought, thirst, dryness. Suhoi means dry. And so Izasuhu Победим. And we will defeat drought. And so here you have Stalin looking at a map thoughtfully. And this is the Caspian Sea that the Volga enters into. And you just see that, here we're going to just have productive grids and infrastructure coming into it. And there really was a project that never quite got out the ground. But one time I spent a good time following this thread. The idea was that, we've got major drought problems. We could be so much more productive if we could conquer drought. And we are rimmed to the south by all these permanently ice and snow-capped mountains. What we will do is um, we will we will transfer alpine snow and build kind of pipes and canals to irrigate the dry spot plains of Central Asia and Kazakhstan. Now these plans never quite get off the ground. Um, but they stand as an example of the kind of can-do ethos, like we are on the side of right, we are moving history forward, and we can do anything. A real lack of humility, if you will. And then there are also, and here there were attempts, unsuccessful, to reroute rivers that again, we've got all these, great rivers, and the three massive rivers are the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Lena. Here's a quick trick to remember. If someone says, what are the three major rivers stretching across Eurasia in Russia? Think oil. Ob, Yenisei, Lena. Yena. And there's lots of oil and gas in Russia too. So that's Ob. Ob, Yenisei, Lena, you're welcome. Oil. Um, and they said, well, all these rivers are going just flowing north and emptying into the Arctic Ocean, that doesn't need the water. We will reroute these rivers. And again, none of these projects are successful. A good amount of money goes into them. They're all failures. Much, probably the most successful, and this is very sad. I have a different lecture about the Aral Sea, but so down here is the Aral Sea. The Caspian and the Aral Sea are two inland seas. You know, what's the difference between a sea and a lake? Um, uh, the Caspian Sea was actually saltwater, but it has a very, very low salinity, um, salinity level. And compared to the ocean. Anyway, I should show you a different map. The Aral Sea, they were successful in transferring much water from the Aral Sea to irrigate the cotton fields of, in large part, Uzbekistan. And in doing so, drained the Aral Sea and poisoned the surrounding environment, both largely as a result of all the pesticides that were put on surrounding lands and the salinity in the water as the water supply became less and less, the salinity in the water became more and more, such that it became too much for fish to live in water that salty. And so a fishing industry that had existed for centuries dies away. And as the sea evaporated, the soil itself became kind of too toxic. Women's breast milk becomes toxic from just the environment, and this is the injection of so many pesticides. But so the Aral Sea is makes the short list of environmental tragedies of the 20th century. Um, and again is sort of born in that hubris. We can do anything, and there's profit in cotton. Um, Cotton production, water intensive operation was one of Uzbekistan's most profitable um, industries, and you can read all about that in a book by Maya Peterson, Pipe Dreams. So this, so in some ways, the story of Soviet environmental management stands as a cautionary tale. There is a conservation story too, but I won't go too deep into that today. So with that, just kind of getting on our radar screen, an appreciation for that, we will build socialism, and things really were accomplished. And also I wanted to make that point of how there was, you know, the can-do ethos of the Soviet project extended to really transforming nature in ways that to this day remain unrealized. But in some ways, this isn't a perhaps this isn't a particular Soviet thing, right? We have um, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos investing billions of dollars into getting into space. And Elon Musk has, you know, said he wants to, you know, establish life on Mars. Um, so here's someone that has accomplished a tremendous amount in Earth, and his ambitions extend to the cosmos. Um, okay. So, after World War II, Stalin continued to rule for 7 more years. He was a hero. Again, he had when the Germans attacked, it was unexpected, and it was a grim moment where no one really knew what to do. Even fleeing Moscow was on the table, and he didn't, and they stayed, and they turned it around, and the Soviet you kind of sacrifices and losses, but ultimate victory in World War II. Um, uh, when the dust settled, Stalin was absolutely a hero of the Soviet Union. He also became increasingly paranoid. um, in his later years. And Russia was Russia was victorious but devastated. Agricultural production in 1946-ish, when the war ends, is half of what it had been in before the war started. Half. Steel production was at less than half of what it was supposed to be according to the 1941 plan. Remember, everything is command economy 5-year plans. Um, which is just to say that this is a statistic that doesn't necessarily reveal so much. I mean, economists worldwide understood that, the plan was kind of a vision, and you couldn't really trust Soviet statistics because they were always reporting their successes. Um, and it's been thought that the US as an absolute powerhouse, I mean, there is uh, China is trying to overtake the US as an economy, and we'll see. Much may depend on management, and we've just much may have will depend on management and this trade deal that's just been arrived at. Experts are saying, China probably has the upper hand in it, and the US has, suffered a little bit. It will continue to suffer, but that we just didn't have the management at the helm that has been able to negotiate um, positively for U.S. interests. But be that as it may, um, Soviet worldwide economists say, you can't trust. You can read Alec Nove, Nove, a history of the Soviet economy, and these are fictions, these are lies. In some ways, doing my own research about customs and trade, they say, well, these records might be able to take not necessarily as what happened, but as a record of the uh, what people agreed at the customs post that they would say is what happened. um, and so, but the US has been, you know an unparalleled success in terms of economic power. And people agree that one of the reasons that's happened is because kind of we invest in the work of taking stock of what we're doing, and we report it. And then you have educated um, people kind of making decisions accordingly. Not always the best decisions, but there's been this view that, well, transparency is a different question. Certainly right now, I need to change my lecture notes about this point too, because as you probably know, that the current administration has canceled announcing labor statistics in the economy. It is advantageous to the administration if it looks like the economy is doing well, and certainly in the second quarter reports, that wasn't the case at all. And so perhaps taking a page from the Soviet Union, if the statistics aren't in your favor, you make them up or you hide them. But it's important to always do this in palatable language. So, instead of saying, well, gosh, these statistics make it look like we're doing a bad job, what you need to say is, we have real concerns about the methodology, or in this case, they say the previous people were so politicized that these statistics were junk. So kind of ad hominem attacks against predecessors and putting things in palatable languages is one of the things American citizens currently get to hear about why our government is backing off from this commitment to kind of study, record, and report how the American economy operates. Um, the 5-year plan didn't even, and here people can say, wait, why are we making that change? That's different. And if you believe in transparency and honesty, that suggests it's bad. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't say that. There's none of that sort of criticism was an allowed option. So, but nonetheless, post World War II, the destruction is rampant, leading also to hunger. And so Russia went to rebuilding in the wake of the war. From 1948 to 1954, food prices did decline a bit every year as food production went up. And that is one of the reasons, food prices matter a lot in terms of how people think things are going. Like in America, eggs are expensive. Inflation continues to rise despite promises that it wouldn't. And so when food prices are declining, people tend to think things times are good. And surveys of of Soviet citizens say that, these post-year wars, while food prices were going down from 1948 to 1954, they kind of remember as good years, and they could believe that progress was coming. And on the social front, in 1947, the death penalty was abolished. So these are kind of sprouts of, optimism amidst what in 1946-47 was famine, there was drought, there had been there had been um, price spikes, and it is thought that real urban wages by 1952 were about what they had been in 1928. And that was not much better than things had been in 1913, even in the Tsarist Empire. So, um, in World War II, as I mentioned, there's a bit of a liberalization. Um, National patriotism is allowed, some religious worship is allowed, but as the war ends, there's a rollback on that cultural freedom. We need to take control about what's allowed. And the poet, for example, and this episode, Zhdanov was in charge, and the Zhdanovshchina, you don't really need to know who he is, we won't go into any detail, was kind of overseeing this cultural policing of what people say, what ideas circulate. Anna Akhmatova was one of the most famous Soviet poets, and she now is condemned as decadent, and a foreigner. Um, and and in a cultural speech, I mean, this actually, sorry, I have to change my lecture notes because in 1952, in a 1946 speech, like Zhdanov, who's this minister of culture, he criticizes Akhmatova. He calls her a whore and a nun. So, like, you're both a slut and you can't really get someone to sleep with you. And this is from the leader of a government official using this kind of crude ad hominem attack was to American listeners, where our leaders, there's a level of decorum that our leaders maintain. This was beyond the pale. But I have to apologize. I need to change my lecture notes because um, as if you've paid attention, Donald Trump essentially operates in ad hominem attack. He's not an individual that talks about ideas and any measure beyond a slogan. But what he does do is he insults and he makes ad hominem attacks. He calls women that are clearly more accomplished than him in a cognitive realms, for example, stupid. And that's just one of many, many examples. So I'm going to need to revisit this language because I think that Zhdanov criticizing Akhmatova as a whore and a nun, as this horrific, insulting moment, the kind of behavior that shouldn't in any proper civilized society come from a government leader, seems like it's no longer applying, given the change over time that we've seen in America since I first gave this lecture. All right. So and other changes, the Internationale, the song of the Soviet Revolution, was replaced with a more Soviet anthem, in really as if it could have been a page taken out of Orwell. March 5th, 1953, Stalin dies, and he was buried in Red Square along with Lenin. And here are pictures of his funeral where you see many, many people lined up, and you see pictures of the leader being held up, kind of manifestations of that cult of personality in an unfree society where, and again, in theory, there was this ideology and ideas. The way those ideas could be maneuvered, you're better off just celebrating the leader. Whatever the leader says, that's what we go with. And that's how a cult of personality operates. You hang big pictures of the leader's face everywhere. So when Stalin goes, the Here's a picture actually of Stalin and Lavrentia Beria, who was in charge of the secret police, and Stalin's daughter on his lap. And Beria was, by all accounts, the favorite, and he gets ousted. Beria was, we say, the last person shot by the Soviet regime. I mean, remember, one of the things that Stalin did that was so terrible was that he eliminated the Bolsheviks. He eliminated the other early Bolsheviks. He turned on his own party and eliminated the leadership that had participated in the revolution so that he was the last, kind of the last man standing, so to speak. And if you want to be in the inner circle, if you want to survive, you need to cow to what Stalin says. You know, deviation independent thinking rewards no one. Um, After Stalin, and for the rest of the system, as I see it, there still might be an occasional execution, even despite 1947 eliminating the death penalty. But when the leadership, they took Beria down into the basement and shot him. And there's a movie that is both quite macabre with shades of brilliance, that reenacts this in a kind of dark comedic way, the death of Stalin. But so they take Beria down, and because he's a dangerous guy, and they shoot him, and then there's sort of this truce that, like, okay, party members aren't going to be executed anymore for political crimes. And who emerges from this moment is Khrushchev. And Khrushchev will rule, well, he'll be the general secretary of the party, 1953 to 1964. Super tumultuous times. And Nikita Khrushchev, he was born in 1894. So think about it. He's what, 21? Or what, 1894? He's 23. He's 23 when the revolution happens, like a young man of fighting age. He's a Russian born in a poor peasant village in Ukraine. And his dad did odd jobs, was often absentee from work. Historians have determined that his dad often was not showing up for work. And family is an example of kind of an experience that was the experience of so many early Soviet families, where they've got one foot in the countryside growing food and one side in the industrial economy in some city earning wages. And that's kind of the world he inhabited. Grew up quite poor. And Nikita Khrushchev was a peasant who rose up. He had a few years of school. Some of them, supposedly, he even didn't have shoes to wear for some period of time. He spent much of his childhood barefoot. He credited a very influential teacher, Lydia Shevtsova, in inspiring him and kind of taking an interest in investing in him. His grandfather lived in a hut that was a dirt floor hut. Like, that was kind of the world he knew. He herded livestock. Then he got a job as a metal worker. So he was exempt from fighting in World War I. He participated in strikes, becomes a Bolshevik. In the Civil War, he gets appointed as a political commissar. By 1938, he was the party leader in Ukraine. He served in the army. He had a good Bolshevik track record, and he rose in very heady times. Remember, 37, 38, 39, these are the purges where, 750,000 people just get summarily shot in the back, dead by Stalin's henchmen. So he was witness to, and let's face it, participated in a number of unhumanitarian acts. In terms of a personality, it said that Khrushchev was both democratic and domineering. And the latter, that domineering side of him, manifested more from the late 50s, after there was an anti-party coup attempt to make him. to get rid of him. All right, we have just a few minutes. If you need to go, I'm going to kind of stay with Khrushchev just a tad, um, and then we'll pick up next time. Khrushchev famously, having grown up in Ukraine, in 1954, one of his first moves is to transfer Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. Crimea had been annexed by the Russian Empire in 1783. It had been part of the Russian Empire. As I talked about, the makeup, it was a good deal of Crimean Tatars and indigenous people. It's in its last centuries, the Crimean Khanate had kind of diminished. I mean, if the Crimean Khanate you know in 1571, the Crimean Khanate sends a raid that burns half the buildings in Moscow and collects over 20,000 slaves to sell, right? They were a real force in the post-Mongol age for centuries. But by the 17th, 18th century, they really kind of ease into becoming kind of a puppet state of the Ottoman Empire. And so that also the makeup is many indigenous people, Turkic people have come over as well. It's not a predominantly Slavic population by any stretch. It's annexed in 1783, and then we do start to see more Slavic people settling there. And this first wave of that is told beautifully in a book by Kelly O'Neill, Claiming Crimea. And I kind of even added another wave of that in the wake of in World War II. You had when you had all these Crimean Tatars deported because Stalin thought that real Slavs weren't as loyal to the Soviet Union. Here's his nationalities policies. There's he's maybe undermining a little bit of that ideal. And so you have dachas, retirement dachas, so to speak, awarded to retiring military. And so the Crimea does take on a very demographically Russian makeup. The Soviet Union forms, there's no more Russian Empire. And so in 1954, Khrushchev's thinking is, and I think it's been well established, it's not in any loyalty to Ukraine, so to speak, or any attempt to undermine the Soviet Union. No, no, no. Just the water lines and the electricity lines and the infrastructure lines are sort of running to Kiev and operating that way. So it just makes more administrative sense if that little chunk is part of Ukraine. And so that's what happened. That's what he did. And fast forward in 2014, Russia annexes it back from Ukraine, which at that point had been acknowledged by Russia multiple times as a sovereign nation. Okay, we're going to leave it there. And on Wednesday, we'll continue with Khrushchev's role. All right.